In the multiverse, civilizations rise and fall, believing they have mapped the boundaries of possibility, that they have seen the apex of what a living being can become. Empires construct fleets of 10,000 warships and call themselves unstoppable. Orders of warrior monks harness an invisible cosmic energy and call themselves the guardians of peace. Dark lords sit on obsidian thrones and call themselves the masters of all things. And in every one of those universes, that confidence is, to some degree, earned. But confidence forged within a single reality has a fundamental blind spot. It has never had to account for something that was forged somewhere else entirely. Something that didn't climb to the top of one world's power structure, but became the sovereign of death itself, across every world it touched. His name was Jin-Woo. He hadn't meant to be here. That was the first thing. There was no summoning circle, no ancient prophecy, no villain's scheme that had reached across dimensional boundaries and pulled him through. One moment, he had been standing at the epicenter of a sovereign-level clash on Earth. The shadow energy around him tearing the fabric of space as two cosmic forces collided at a scale that threatened to crack the planet beneath his feet. The rift had opened without warning, a wound in reality so vast and sudden that not even the Shadow Monarch's instincts had given him time to react. And then the wound had swallowed him. He fell through nothing. Not darkness, he knew darkness intimately, had been crowned its king. This was something different. An absence of everything. A space between spaces where no shadows existed because there was no light to cast them. For 3 seconds, that felt like 3 lifetimes. Jin-Woo existed in a place that had no name. And then he arrived. The first thing he registered was the smell. Dust, ancient stone, and something burning that had been burning for a long time. The second thing was gravity, slightly lighter than Earth's, pulling at his armor with gentle indifference. The third thing was the sky, and it stopped him completely. 2 moons. One of them was wrong. It hung in the upper atmosphere like a mechanical tumor, a sphere of gray metal the size of a small continent, ringed with towers and trenches and the distant pinprick lights of vessels moving along its surface. It was a structure. Someone had built a moon. The scale of it was staggering even to a man who had walked through dungeons that contained entire civilizations. And Jin-Woo stood on the broken stone street of what appeared to be a ruined city and simply looked at it for a moment. Cataloging, calculating. Jeddah. Though he didn't know the name yet. What he saw was a holy city in the process of being occupied and slowly strangled. Ancient spires of sand-colored stone rose around him, carved with symbols and scripts he didn't recognize, worn smooth by centuries of wind. The streets were narrow and crowded despite everything. Robed pilgrims moving with their heads down, merchants operating from stalls with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned to conduct business beneath the gaze of soldiers. And soldiers there were. Tall men in white armor that covered them head to toe, but carrying weapons that glowed faintly at their tips. Moving in patrols of 4 with the synchronized boredom of an occupying force that had stopped expecting resistance. Jin-Woo's eyes moved across the scene with the calm, precise assessment of someone who had evaluated threat levels in thousands of environments. The soldiers registered as low. The weapons were unfamiliar, but clearly projectile or energy-based. He filed that for later. The city was tense in the specific way that cities under occupation were always tense. People moving quickly, eyes down, the collective held breath of a population waiting for something to get worse. He took a step forward and his boot crunched on rubble, and the nearest patrol of 4 white-armored soldiers turned toward the sound. They saw him, and everything about their body language changed instantly. He understood why. The Dragon Emperor armor that encased him was not something that belonged in any normal world. Black plates trimmed with the deep violet of sovereign energy, shadow wisping from his pauldrons like slow smoke, his eyes carrying that faint purple luminescence that had once made S-rank hunters step backward involuntarily. He looked like something that had walked out of a mythology that this galaxy had never developed. "Halt!" The lead soldier raised his weapon, a blaster rifle, though Jin-Woo didn't have that word for it yet. "Identify yourself and state your business in the Holy City." Sung Jin-Woo looked at the man for exactly 1 second. He was trying to determine if these people were hostile, if this was a dungeon, like if there was any version of this situation where the next 30 seconds didn't end with someone making a decision and they couldn't take back. He was tired. The dimensional transit had cost him something, not power. His power was fully intact. He could feel the vast reservoir of shadow energy coiled inside him like a sleeping ocean. But orientation. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know the rules of this place. And Sung Jin-Woo, who had become the Shadow Monarch precisely because he was smarter than every situation he had ever been dropped into, defaulted to patience when he had enough information to justify it. He raised one hand slowly, not in surrender, just to signal that he wasn't going to move yet. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said in Korean, because it was all he had. The soldiers exchanged glances behind their visored helmets. The lead one stepped forward. "Unknown individual, you are in violation of Imperial Presence protocols. You will come with us for processing, or you will be detained by force." Jin-Woo didn't speak their language, but he understood the tone perfectly. He had heard it in every nation, every dungeon, every S-rank gate. The tone that said, "We have authority here, and you will submit to it." He lowered his hand slowly. Above the city, on the surface of the mechanical moon, a single officer was watching sensor readings that had just produced a result his instruments were not designed to interpret. A life form had appeared on Jedha's surface, not arrived via shuttle, not transported, not emerged from a building. It had simply existed where it hadn't a moment before. And the energy signature it was producing matched nothing in the Imperial database. He flagged it immediately and sent the report up the chain. By the time it reached the office of the Grand Inquisitor, Jin-Woo had already decided that patience had a limit. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The first blaster bolt hit him in the chest and disappeared. Not deflected, not absorbed by armor in any conventional sense. It entered the shadow energy field around him and ceased to exist, consumed by something older and darker than any technology this galaxy had produced. Jin-Woo looked down at the spot where the bolt had struck. He then looked back up at the 4 soldiers who had just made the worst decision of their careers. The purple light in his eyes brightened slightly. "That," he said quietly, still in Korean, still perfectly calm, "was a mistake." The 4 stormtroopers of the Jedha garrison had a combined total of 11 years of Imperial service between them. They had participated in 3 planetary occupations, suppressed 2 insurgencies, and stood post during the kind of grinding, thankless work that formed the backbone of Imperial control across the Outer Rim. They were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were simply catastrophically unprepared for what happened next. The second blaster bolt never reached Jin-Woo. It stopped in midair approximately 2 meters from his chest, hanging in space like a frozen star, its red energy flickering at the edges as though reality itself was uncertain what to do with it. The third and fourth bolts stopped beside it. The stormtroopers stared. Even through the expressionless white visors of their helmets, The paralysis was total and absolute. The specific frozen quality of trained soldiers whose training had just become completely irrelevant. Jin-Woo's right hand was raised, not dramatically, not with the theatrical flourish of someone performing power. Simply raised, the way a man might hold up a hand to stop a door from closing. The ruler's authority extended from him like a tide going out. Invisible, immense, indifferent to the laws of physics this galaxy had agreed upon. The 3 bolts hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds. Then they curved gently, with almost contemptuous laziness, and redirected themselves back toward the patrol. He didn't send them back at lethal velocity. He let them drop harmlessly to the stone street at the soldiers' feet, scorching the ancient paving, while cleaving small black craters that smelled of ozone and confusion. A warning, he was still in patience mode, still gathering information, but the patrol had already triggered their comms. "Command, this is TK-4471. We have a situation in Sector 7, requesting immediate backup. The subject is demonstrating unknown." The trooper's voice cracked slightly on the word unknown, the way voices do when a person is trying to use professional language to describe something for which no professional language exists. Unknown capability, bolts are not. The subject is not responding to. TK-4471, clarify your report. He stopped the bolts command, in the air, without touching them. A pause on the comm channel. And then, repeat that. Jin-Woo had stopped listening to the sounds he couldn't understand and started paying attention to the city around him. His instincts, sharpened across thousands of dungeon floors and hundreds of S-rank encounters, were already building a picture. Occupied territory. The white-armored soldiers were enforcers for whoever controlled this place from that mechanical structure in the sky. The locals hated them. He could read it in every averted eye and hunched shoulder of every robed figure who had witnessed the exchange, and was now trying very hard to be somewhere else. He had been dropped into the middle of a war, not an active battle, but the slow, grinding, suffocating kind of war that occupation always was, the kind where the violence was structural and constant even on the days no one fired a weapon. And he began to walk. The patrol scrambled to follow, maintaining distance now, comms alive with urgent chatter he couldn't translate but could read perfectly. They were not going to engage again yet. They were waiting for reinforcements and directions. Smart. He filed that away. These soldiers had discipline, even if their weapons were useless against him. Discipline meant chain of command. Chain of command meant someone at the top who would eventually want to deal with him personally. He was curious who that would be. The city opened up ahead of him as he moved through the narrow streets. A plaza of sorts, ringed by ancient statuary of figures in robes, their stone faces worn featureless by centuries of desert wind. A Kyber crystal shrine, though again he had no name for it. Its pale luminescence emanating from behind carved stone lattice with a quality of light that was different from ordinary light. Cleaner. He paused in front of it without entirely knowing why. The shadows around him behaved strangely near it. Not retreating. The shadows never retreated from the Shadow Monarch. They were an extension of him the way fingers were extensions of a hand. But shifting, reorienting, as though the light from the shrine was a different kind of light than the sun above, one that the shadows felt the need to consider. He filed that too. 3 levels above the surface of Jeddah, in the Imperial Command Center embedded in the occupation garrison's primary tower, Director Orson Krennic was not having a good morning and was about to have a significantly worse one. The report from TK-4471 had reached him within 4 minutes of the initial incident, and he had spent 2 of those minutes reading it 3 times because he was certain there was a translation error or a technical malfunction somewhere in the chain. There wasn't. "Pull the visual," he said, and the holographic display in front of him resolved into shaky helmet cam footage of the plaza encounter. He watched the blaster bolts stop. He watched them redirect. He watched the figure in black armor with the impossible aesthetic. Nothing in the Imperial design catalog, nothing in any design catalog he had ever seen. Simply turn and walk away from 4 armed stormtroopers as though they were mildly interesting furniture. Krennic clasped his hands behind his back and was quiet for a very long moment. "Now, get me the garrison commander," he said finally, "and flag this report to ISB." He paused, and another pause, longer. "Flag it to Lord Vader." His aide looked up. Contacting Darth Vader directly, without going through the proper Imperial channels, was the kind of decision that ended careers on good days and ended lives on bad ones. "Sir, are you certain you want to?" Something just appeared on the surface of this moon that stopped blaster fire with its hand. Krennic said, very quietly, very precisely. "Yes, I am certain." On the Executor, Darth Vader's superstar destroyer currently positioned 3 systems away, coordinating a blockade. The Dark Lord of the Sith felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt the Force go quiet. Not the quiet of meditation or the quiet of space. The quiet of a signal interrupted. A frequency he had been hearing as background noise his entire life, suddenly developing a gap in it, a pocket of absence that his senses kept sliding off of, like a hand trying to grip smooth, transparent steel. He stood at the viewport of his private chamber, black cape motionless, breathing the slow, mechanical rhythm of the suit's respirator, and reached out through the Force toward the disturbance. He found nothing. Not the nothing of empty space. Not the nothing of a shielded mind or a hidden Force user suppressing their presence. This was different. This was a something that registered as nothing. A shape made of absence. An entity-shaped hole in the Force that somehow also felt, at its edges, like extraordinary power. Like looking at a black hole and understanding that the darkness itself had mass and gravity and intent. Vader had felt darkness before. He had wielded it, lived inside it, been remade by it. He knew every flavor of the dark side, from the cold, intellectual darkness of ancient Sith philosophy to the hot, savage darkness of uncontrolled rage. What he felt emanating from the direction of Jedha was not the dark side. It was something the Force had no category for. He turned from the viewport. "Prepare my shuttle," he said. The officer who received the order didn't ask where they were going. When Darth Vader said "prepare my shuttle" in that particular register of voice, not commanding, not threatening, but quiet and certain the way deep water is quiet and certain, experienced Imperial officers had learned that questions were a waste of everyone's remaining time. On the surface of Jedha, Sung Jin-Woo found a relatively intact building on the edge of the plaza and stepped inside. He needed to think. He needed to understand where he was, how he'd gotten here, and more importantly, how to get back. He had people to return to. That was the only thing that mattered. He sat on a broken stone bench in the dim interior, closed his eyes, and reached inward, into the vast, dark reservoir where his power lived, where the shadows of 10,000 extracted soldiers waited at perfect attention. His army was there, every single one of them, waiting. He was not alone in this galaxy, not even slightly. The survivors of Jedha's underground knew the city the way water knows stone. Slowly, completely, through every crack and hollow and hidden passage that the Imperial occupation had failed to map. They moved beneath the streets in networks of ancient tunnels that predated the Empire by 1,000 years, carved by pilgrims who had understood that holy places always eventually attracted people who wanted to control them and had built accordingly. It was in one of these tunnels, 3 levels beneath the plaza, where Jin-Woo had redirected 4 blaster bolts with the casual authority of a man shooing flies, that Chirrut Imwe sat in perfect stillness and listened to the Force tell him something extraordinary. Chirrut was blind. He was also, in ways that the Jedi Order would have found theologically inconvenient, and one of the most Force-attuned individuals on Jedha. A guardian of the Whills, a keeper of traditions older than the Republic. A man whose relationship with the cosmic energy field was less about power and more about listening. He didn't wield the Force the way Jedi did. He heard it, and right now, it was saying something he had never heard it say before. It was saying nothing, about one specific point in the city above him. "Baze," he said. The large man cleaning his cannon across the tunnel didn't look up. "I know. You felt it? I felt you go still, which means something unusual is happening, which in this city means something is about to get complicated." Baze Malbus set down his weapon and finally looked at his oldest friend. "What is it?" Chirrut turned his clouded eyes upward, toward the stone ceiling, toward the plaza above it, toward the thing that sat in the abandoned building on its edge with the quality of a stone dropped into the Force's surface, creating not ripples, but a perfect, unnatural stillness. "It is a person," he said slowly, working through it the way he worked through everything, with patience and precision. "But the Force does not know them. It reaches toward them the way it reaches toward everything, and then it..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Slides away, as though they are not part of the pattern." "Not part of the pattern," Baze repeated flatly. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." Chirrut stood, reaching for his staff. "I think we should find out." Jin-Woo heard them before he saw them. 2 sets of footsteps, the one light and precise, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where their feet were, despite apparent blindness. One heavier and deliberate. He didn't move from the broken bench. He had already assessed the building's 4 entry points and cataloged the shadows in every corner, deep, available, ready. He was not concerned. He was curious. The 2 men who entered through the building's side archway were not soldiers. The blind one moved with a staff and wore robes and had the quality of someone deeply comfortable with silence. The large one carried what appeared to be an enormous weapon, but held it with the ease of long familiarity rather than aggression. Neither of them radiated the tightly controlled anxiety of the white armored patrol. They radiated something else entirely. Calm, Jin-Woo thought. Genuine calm, not the kind that came from certainty rather than ignorance. Chirrut stopped 3 meters away and tilted his head. Up close, the absence was even more pronounced. A man-shaped space in the Force's fabric. And yet the power emanating from him was undeniable even to non-sensitive perception. The shadow energy that wisped from his armor moved with obvious intent. The purple luminescence of his eyes was not technological. This was not a machine or an alien species Chirrut had simply never encountered. This was something genuinely new. "You stopped their blasters," Chirrut said, in Galactic Basic, which Jin-Woo still didn't speak. Jin-Woo looked at him, said nothing. Chirrut blinked, tried again, this time in Hutes, then in a dialect of High Galactic. Jin-Woo's expression remained the same. Attentive, calm, revealing nothing, and Buzz tried a regional dialect of Outer Rim Basic. Nothing. They regarded each other across the language barrier with mutual assessment. Then Chirrut did something unexpected. He laughed, quietly, genuinely, the laugh of a man who found the universe's sense of humor endearing rather than frustrating. He lowered his staff slightly, the universal gesture of non-aggression that transcended language, and pointed to himself. "Chirrut," he said, then to his companion. "Baze." Jin-Woo looked at them for a moment. Then, with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who understood that communication was a tool, and tools should be used when available. Jin-Woo. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then what followed was an hour of the most creative nonverbal communication Jin-Woo had engaged in since a dungeon in which the boss monster had turned out to be intelligent and interested in negotiation. Chirrut had a gift for it. The kind of expressive precision that came from decades of communicating meaning without relying on any single sense. Through gesture, demonstration, and what Jin-Woo gradually recognized as an almost supernatural ability to read micro-expressions, the blind guardian managed to convey, "Where did you come from? What are you? And do you intend harm to the people of this city?" Jin-Woo managed to convey, with equal creativity, "Somewhere else entirely. Something you don't have a category for." And no, Anders watched this exchange with the expression of a man who had long ago accepted that his life contained unusual elements and had simply adjusted his baseline for what counted as remarkable. What Chirrut couldn't convey through gesture, but felt with complete certainty through his connection to the living force, was this: the man sitting across from them was not evil. The darkness around him was real and vast and ancient. But it wasn't the darkness of the Sith, not the grasping, hungry darkness of people who had chosen power over everything else and been hollowed out by it. This was different. This was a darkness that had been inhabited so thoroughly that it had become a home rather than a corruption. The Force didn't know what to do with him because he was genuinely outside its taxonomy. Not light, not dark, not the gray balance that some philosophies described, something orthogonal to the entire spectrum. That was not, Chirrut decided, necessarily a problem. He had been a guardian of the wills long enough to know that the Force's categories were descriptive, not prescriptive. The Force described what existed. It did not limit what could exist. Above the city, the situation was escalating with imperial efficiency. 2 additional platoons of stormtroopers had been dispatched to locate and contain the anomaly, moving in a sweep pattern through the sector where Jin-Woo had last been sighted. 3 probe droids had been deployed with enhanced sensor packages recalibrated to detect the specific energy signature. Not that anyone in the Imperial Science Division had any framework for what that signature was. But they were very good at detecting things they didn't understand and flagging them for people further up the chain. The further up the chain was arriving within 6 hours. But Jin-Woo became aware of the sweep teams long before they reached his building, not through the Force, which was their domain, but through the shadows. Every shadow in the sector was his to read, and through them he perceived the systematic movement of white-armored figures converging in a pattern he recognized immediately. He had been hunted before, in dungeons, in gates, by monsters that coordinated with more intelligence than most people credited them. This was not so different. He stood. Chirrut immediately read the shift in his posture. "Baze," he said quietly. "I see them." Baze had moved to the building's window, observing the distant sweep teams. He looked back at Jin-Woo with an expression that asked a question without words. "What are you going to do?" Jin-Woo reached out through the shadows and counted. 48 soldiers in the sweep pattern, 3 mechanical floating objects with scanning equipment, 1 officer coordinating from an elevated position 2 streets away. He thought about patience. He thought about information. He still needed to understand this place, Still needed to find whatever the equivalent of a gate exit might be in this galaxy. Still needed enough time to think without an army trying to box him in. He looked at Chirrut and Baze. Then he looked at the floor. In the stone beneath them, where the ancient tunnels ran, the shadows were very deep and very welcoming. He pressed one hand to the floor. The shadows rose. Chirrut felt it happen without seeing it. A vast displacement of darkness, rising from the ground like water from a spring. And then the sensation of movement without moving. Of space folding around them with the casual authority of something that had been rearranging reality since before this city was built. When the shadows settled, all three of them were in the tunnels below. Behind them, 48 stormtroopers swept through empty streets and found nothing but scorched paving stones and the faint smell of something ancient and dark that none of their instruments had a reading for. In the Force, Darth Vader's shuttle crossed into Jeddah's atmosphere. And in the gap in the pattern where Jin-Woo existed, something shifted. The faintest pressure of awareness, like two black holes becoming conscious of each other's gravity from across a vast distance. Neither man knew yet what that awareness meant. But the Force, which knew everything eventually, was already making arrangements. The tunnels beneath Jeddah were a cathedral of a different kind than the ones above ground, where the surface shrines celebrated the Force through carved stone and burning kyber light. The tunnels celebrated something older: survival, persistence, the stubborn refusal of a people to be entirely consumed by whatever power had decided to consume them this century. Torches burned in iron brackets. Voices murmured behind heavy curtains hung across tunnel branches. Children sat against walls doing the things children did in occupied cities throughout history. Games invented from nothing. Stories told in whispers, the remarkable human capacity for ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. Jin-Woo walked through it all with his armor slightly dimmed and the shadow energy pulled inward by instinct. He had learned in S-rank gates that full visible power in unfamiliar territory attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention before you were ready to deal with it. He observed. A camp of perhaps 200 people, mostly civilian from their bearing, but with a harder core of perhaps 30 who moved differently, carried themselves differently, whose eyes tracked him with the specific alertness of people who had decided at some point that they were willing to fight. Chirrut walked beside him, navigating the tunnels with his staff and his uncanny spatial awareness, providing what guidance he could through gesture and expression. Baz walked behind them both with his cannon and the particular patience of a man who had long ago accepted that the universe was going to do whatever it wanted, and his job was simply to make sure Chirrut survived it. They brought him to a space that served as the camp's central gathering area, a natural cavern perhaps 20 meters across, its ceiling lost in shadows that Jin-Woo could read like text. Crates of supplies were stacked along the walls. A rough map of the city had been drawn on one wall in chalk, and standing in the middle of it, arms crossed, expression doing the specific calculation of a leader weighing an unknown factor against present resources, was a woman who introduced herself through Chirrut's halting pantomime translation as Saw Gerrera. She was missing one leg below the knee, replaced by a mechanical apparatus that she moved on with total unself-consciousness. She had the eyes of someone who had been at war so long that peace had become a theoretical concept she intellectually understood, but couldn't quite viscerally imagine anymore. She looked at Jin-Woo the way a general looks at an asset, not with hostility, not with welcome, but with the cold arithmetic of utility. She said something at length. Chirrut translated in gesture. "What are you? What can you do? And what do you want from us?" Jin-Woo appreciated the directness. He had spent enough time around people who buried their actual questions under layers of social performance to find bluntness refreshing. He held up 3 fingers and answered each question as clearly as the language barrier allowed. 1. He was from somewhere else. He pointed upward, and then made a gesture that tried to convey much further than up, which Chirrut translated with a thoughtful expression that suggested he understood it to mean something dimensional rather than simply astronomical. 2. He demonstrated. He raised his hand and pulled the shadows from the ceiling of the cavern, drawing them into a shape. Not threatening, just illustrative. A column of organized darkness that moved with obvious intelligent direction before he released it and let the shadows return to their natural positions. The camp went very quiet. Even the children stopped their games. 3. He made the gesture he had been refining over the past hour. A circular motion that Chirrut had come to understand meant a way back to where I came from. He didn't know if such a thing existed in this galaxy, but it was what he wanted. All in honesty about objectives was, in his experience, more strategically sound than deception when you were dependent on local knowledge. Saw Gerrera watched all of this and then said something short and definitive. Chirrut's expression shifted, not alarm, but consideration. He gestured to Jin-Woo. She says she doesn't know how to send you home, but she knows who might have answers, and she wants something in return for the introduction. Jin-Woo waited. The something in return, as best as Chirrut could convey it, involved the Imperial Garrison's outer processing facility, a prefabricated structure the Empire had bolted to the side of an ancient temple 3 weeks ago to process and catalog the Kyber crystals they were systematically extracting from Jedha's mines. It held records. Specifically, and it held the extraction schedules and supply chain documentation that Saw's network desperately needed and had been unable to acquire, because the facility had 4 squads of stormtroopers, 2 ATST walkers, and a perimeter sensor grid. Jin-Woo looked at the rough map on the wall. Chirrut pointed to the facility's location. Jin-Woo studied it for approximately 4 seconds. He held up one finger. One condition. He pointed to himself, and then made a gesture that Chirrut, with his remarkable sensitivity, correctly interpreted as, "No one gets killed who doesn't have to be." Saw Gerrera looked at that for a moment, then made a sound that might have been a laugh and said something that Chirrut translated with a small smile. She says that's more restraint than she usually asks for, but she accepts. They went at the deepest point of the local night, when the mechanical moon above was positioned to cast its orbital shadow across that section of the city, and the natural darkness was as complete as Jedha ever allowed. Jin-Woo went alone. That had been his condition's practical extension. He had seen enough of Saw's fighters to understand that bringing them would create variables he'd have to manage, and he didn't need them. He needed them to stay safe so Chirrut could keep translating. The facility's sensor grid found him immediately. Of course it did. He wasn't hiding from technology. He was moving through shadows at a speed that the sensors registered as a series of disconnected anomalies rather than a continuous target. There and then, not there and then there again. Each instance lasting less than the sensor sweep's update cycle. The first ATST turned its head toward an anomaly reading on its left. By the time its mechanical neck completed the movement, Jin-Woo was behind it, one hand pressed to its hull. The shadow energy moved through the metal like water through cloth, finding the pilots inside. Not killing, he had given his word on restraint, but filling the cockpit with concentrated darkness that induced immediate unconsciousness as efficiently as any sedative. The walker went still. The second ATST turned toward the sound of the first one stopping. Same result. 12 seconds total. The perimeter squads were next, and this was where Jin-Woo made his first real decision about this world's inhabitants. He could feel 40 lives through the shadows, not with the Force, which wasn't his to use. Okay, but with the Shadow Monarch's intrinsic awareness of all living things within his domain of darkness. 40 soldiers doing their jobs. 40 people who, in a different world, in different circumstances, might have been doing something else entirely. He thought about the civilians in the tunnels above. Thought about children playing games against tunnel walls. He had made a promise. The extraction took 4 minutes. 38 soldiers rendered unconscious by shadow saturation, their weapons simply ceasing to function as the shadow energy moved through them. 2 soldiers who had been positioned inside the facility itself were left entirely alone. They were sitting at a table sharing a meal, and he flowed past them through the darkness without disturbing so much as the air. Found the records terminal and looked at it. He couldn't read it. Of course he couldn't. He pressed his hand to it and let the shadow energy flow through the hardware the way it had flowed through the ATST. Not reading the data, but extracting the physical storage medium with careful precision, pulling the data core from the machine like removing a tooth. He held it up, small, dense, full of information he couldn't access, but that someone in those tunnels could. He was back in the cavern within 7 minutes of leaving it. Saw Guerrera stared at the data core in his hand, then at the facility outside where every guard was unconscious and both walkers were dark, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something to Chirrut that she clearly hadn't expected to say. Chirrut turned to Jin-Woo with an expression of genuine interest. She says, he conveyed through their developing gestural language, that she knows someone who studies things that fall from other places. Someone the Empire is very afraid of. Someone who might understand what you are. Jin-Woo waited. She says. Chirrut paused, as though working through the name's significance. She says his name is Galen Erso. Above the city, Darth Vader's shuttle broke through the cloud layer and began its descent. The landing lights cutting through Jeddah's perpetual dust like cold white blades. In the Force, the gap where Jin-Woo should have been registered to Vader's perception like a wound that wouldn't resolve, present enough to locate, absent enough to defy comprehension. He had felt darkness before. He had never felt its sovereign. He intended to rectify that immediately. Darth Vader descended the shuttle ramp onto Jeddah's surface with the particular quality of presence that had made entire planetary governments reconsider their positions without a single weapon being drawn. The mechanical rhythm of his breathing cut through the desert wind. The Force moved around him the way weather moves around a mountain. Not because the mountain commanded it, but because the mountain simply was immovable and absolute. And the Force had long ago learned to flow around the shape of him. Stormtroopers snapped to attention. Officers straightened their backs with the reflexive urgency of people who understood that Vader's attention was something to be deserved rather than simply received. He stood at the base of the ramp and reached out. The gap was closer now. 3 kilometers, roughly northeast, done moving with unhurried purpose through the city's lower districts. Vader had spent the shuttle descent attempting to categorize what he felt, running it against every experience of Force perception he had accumulated across decades of war, diplomacy, and combat. He had felt dark side users of extraordinary power. Palpatine himself, whose presence in the Force was like standing next to a collapsing star. He had felt ancient artifacts that radiated darkness so concentrated it had physical weight. He had felt the echoes of dead worlds still screaming their final moments into the Force centuries after their destruction. None of those things felt like this. This felt like a door. A door in the Force's fabric, present and obvious and completely sealed, behind which something vast and dark and entirely self-contained existed without reference to anything outside itself. It wasn't reaching into the Force. It wasn't drawing from it or pushing against it. It was simply there, the way a planet is there, not participating in the Force so much as occupying space within it, indifferent to the field that connected all other living things. Vader had never encountered indifference to the Force before. Resistance, yes. Suppression, yes. Absence in the dead zones where the Force thinned. But indifference, the quality of something that simply didn't need it, was new. He found it, philosophically, extremely interesting. He found it, tactically, extremely concerning. "That, Commander," he said to the garrison officer, who had materialized at his left shoulder with the anxious precision of someone trying very hard to be useful. "Show me where it went." Jin-Woo was aware of Vader the moment the shuttle landed, not through any mystical sense, through the shadows. The darkness of Jeddah's night was his to read, and through it he perceived the shape of a man who moved through the world differently than other men moved through it. Not because of physical capability, though the mechanical suit suggested considerable physical enhancement. Because of the space around him. Other people moved through space. This man moved through space, and the space moved back, subtly, the way air moves before a pressure wave arrives. Jin-Woo had met people like that before. He had become one. He filed Vader as significant and continued following Chirrut through the tunnel network toward a secondary exit that would take them toward the outskirts of the city, where Saw's contact could arrange transport to the coordinates where Galen Erso was supposedly located. The data core retrieval had bought them passage. The passage had a narrow window. Jin-Woo was focused, but the gap between him and Vader was closing. Whoever this black-armored figure was, they were tracking him with a precision that street-by-street searching shouldn't have produced. They were tracking him through something else. Something that Jin-Woo didn't fully understand yet, but had been observing with increasing interest since Chirrut had first demonstrated it. The blind man navigated perfectly sealed darkness. The soldiers communicated through it somehow. The shrine had made his shadows shift. There was a system here, an energy field of some kind that permeated everything, and that the people of this galaxy interacted with in ways that had nothing to do with technology. He was going to need to understand it, but not in the next 4 minutes. "Move faster," he said in Korean, and Chirrut understood from his tone and posture exactly what he meant. They moved faster. Vader found the tunnels when a patrol unit, following the last sensor ghost of Jin-Woo's shadow transit, located a concealed entrance that the garrison had missed in their initial mapping. He descended without hesitation, 2 squads of stormtroopers behind him, and followed the gap in the Force through stone corridors that smelled of torch smoke and habitation. What he found instead of his target was the camp. 200 civilians who went very still at the sight of him. The silence of pure collective fear settling over the cavern with the weight of something physical. Children pressed against walls. Adults stood frozen between the instinct to protect and the certain knowledge that there was nothing here that could protect anything from Darth Vader. Vader looked at the camp, looked at the chalk map on the wall, looked at the empty space in the Force where his target had been and was no longer, because Jin-Woo had moved them through the shadows again the moment Vader's presence registered in Chirrut's awareness. The blind guardian had felt the dark side approaching like a storm front, and had simply said one word that translated across every language barrier. "Now." He looked at the civilian faces around him and said, yes, with the flat precision of someone issuing a weather report, "Where did it go?" No one spoke. Of course, no one spoke. Vader reached into the Force, not to find Jin-Woo, that gap was already 3 tunnels away and accelerating, but to read the room, the residual impressions that living beings left in the Force's fabric, like footprints in sand. He read fear, which was expected. He read resolve, which was noted. He read in the residual impression of the space where Jin-Woo had stood for the past several hours. Something he had not anticipated at all. Curiosity. The being had been curious about the Force, had been studying it, observing it, categorizing it with the methodical patience of someone who encountered new systems and analyzed them rather than dismissing them. It wasn't trying to tap into the Force, it was trying to understand it. Of the way an engineer studies a machine they've never seen before, working out the principles by observation. Vader stood in the empty cavern and breathed his slow mechanical breaths and recalculated. He had come to Jedha expecting to find a dark side anomaly, something that had stumbled into Force sensitivity through accident or corruption, something that needed to be assessed and either turned to Imperial use or eliminated. What he had found instead was evidence of something that didn't need the Force at all, and was examining it with the detached scientific interest of a being that had its own power system and was simply filing the local one for reference. That was a fundamentally different problem. He turned to the garrison commander, who had followed him down at what he clearly hoped was a safe distance. I want every sensor array in this city recalibrated to track energy signatures outside our standard parameters. I want this tunnel network fully mapped within 2 hours, and I want a direct line to the Emperor's office. He paused. Tell them we have encountered something that does not exist in our classification systems and request guidance on priority. The commander's voice was admirably steady. Yes, Lord Vader. And the civilians, sir? Vader looked at 200 people looking back at him. Looked at children trying to be invisible against stone walls. In the Force, their fear registered as a chorus of small, bright points of life. The specific brightness that fear produced when it was clean fear rather than guilty fear. The fear of the innocent in the path of something terrible. He thought about the being that had passed through this camp and chosen not to kill 40 soldiers it could have destroyed without effort. He thought about the word curiosity and what it implied about intent. Leave them, he said. And the garrison commander managed, just barely, to conceal his surprise. 4 kilometers northeast, through 3 shadow transits that deposited them in progressively better lit sections of the city's outer ring, Jin-Woo stood in the pre-dawn cold of Jedha's desert edge and looked at the transport that Saw's contact had arranged. It was a battered freighter of a design he didn't recognize, crewed by 2 people who looked at his armor with the professional blankness of individuals who had learned that asking questions about cargo was bad for business longevity. Chirrut put his hand on Jin-Woo's arm and gestured. The gesture that in their developing language meant, "Are you all right?" Jin-Woo considered the question. He was unhurt. His power was fully intact, his army waiting in the shadows with perfect patience. His ruler's authority and shadow exchange operating without any degradation from dimensional transit. He was in an unknown galaxy with no current path home, being tracked by a dark-armored figure of considerable power, and about to board an unfamiliar vessel to find a scientist he'd never heard of, who might or might not have any useful information. He had operated in worse situations, considerably worse. He gestured back, the gesture that meant, yes. Let's go. Baze Malbus looked at the freighter, looked at Jin-Woo, and shouldered his cannon with the resigned acceptance of a man who had stopped being surprised by Tuesdays. He boarded first, checking sightlines out of pure habit, and Jin-Woo followed into the vessel's dim interior as Jedha's mechanical moon began its slow arc toward the horizon. Behind them, in the Force, Vader stood perfectly still in an empty tunnel and let the gap recede until it was too distant to track precisely. Then he reached further, past Jedha, past the system, toward Coruscant, toward a presence in the Force that was vast and ancient and waiting, the way a spider waits, perfectly still at the center of a web that covered a galaxy. "My master," he said, into the comm. "We have a situation. On Coruscant, in an office at the top of the world." Darth Sidious opened his yellow eyes and smiled. The freighter was called the Uncertain Mercy, which Baze had read off the hull plating before boarding, and which Chirrut had found philosophically appropriate when it was conveyed to him. It moved through Jeddah's atmosphere with the practiced nonchalance of a vessel that had made a career of not attracting attention, its transponder broadcasting the registration of a mining equipment supplier 3 systems away, whose actual ship was currently sitting in a repair dock on Corellia, and whose owner had no idea his codes were being borrowed. Jin-Woo sat in the cargo hold on a crate of something that rattled and watched the planet fall away through a viewport the size of his hand. He had seen space before. The dimensional transit that brought him here had passed through something that was technically space, though space of a variety that didn't correspond to any physical reality. He had not seen it like this. Clean and black and absolutely enormous. The stars fixed and cold and impossibly numerous. The mechanical moon rotating slowly in its orbit below them with the patient malevolence of something built by people who wanted you to look at it and understand what it meant. It meant, we can do this to your world too. He understood the message perfectly. He also found it, from his particular vantage point, somewhat quaint. He had faced things that made that moon look like a moderately ambitious construction project. Chirrut settled across from him with his staff across his knees and the expression of a man composing a question he wasn't sure how to ask. The language barrier remained substantial, but over the past several hours, their gestural vocabulary had developed with the efficiency of 2 intelligent people who were motivated to communicate. Chirrut pointed at Jin-Woo, then made the gesture for shadows, then made a new gesture, both hands moving outward from his chest, indicating something large, something that extended beyond the immediate body. "How many?" he was asking. "How many shadows?" Jin-Woo held up a hand and spread his fingers, then folded them, then spread them again, then kept spreading and folding, the gesture indicating repetition beyond simple counting, until Chirrut's expression moved through surprise into something more carefully neutral. The expression of someone recalibrating a threat assessment upward by several significant magnitudes. Baze, you who had been watching from the hold's far corner with his cannon propped beside him, said something to Chirrut in their own language. Chirrut responded. Baze was quiet for a moment, then looked at Jin-Woo with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was very direct. The look of a man who wanted to establish something clearly. He pointed at Jin-Woo, then at himself, then at Chirrut, then made a protective gesture, arms crossing, shielding, a question and a statement simultaneously. "Are we safe with you?" Jin-Woo looked at him steadily, then nodded once with the specific quality of someone for whom a nod was a binding commitment rather than a social pleasantry. Baze held his gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded back and looked away. Contract established. The coordinates Saw had provided took them to a relay point, not directly to Galen Erso, because nothing involving the Empire's most sensitive projects was ever directly accessible, but to a contact who could arrange the next step in what turned out to be a carefully compartmentalized chain of communication. The contact was a rebellion intelligence operative named Melshi, who met them at a way station orbiting a gas giant whose name Jin-Woo didn't know, and whose amber and cream cloud bands were the most beautiful thing he had seen since arriving in this galaxy. Melshi was a compact man with the permanent slight squint of someone who had spent too many years looking for things that didn't want to be found. He looked at Jin-Woo, looked at Chirrut, looked back at Jin-Woo and said, "Saw sent you." Chirrut confirmed it. "Order and this one." Melshi studied Jin-Woo's armor with the careful attention of an intelligence operative cataloging an unknown asset. This one is the thing that put 40 stormtroopers down on Jedha without killing any of them, and walked through a sensor grid like it wasn't there. Chirrut's gesture conveyed the same. Melshi was quiet for a moment. Then, the Alliance wants to meet him. This was how Sung Jin-Woo found himself, 6 hours after arriving in a galaxy he had never heard of, sitting in a holographic communications chamber aboard a Rebel Alliance frigate whose name he couldn't read, looking at a three-dimensional projection of a silver-haired woman who had the eyes of someone who had been making impossible choices for so long that the weight of them had become simply the weight of her, inseparable from who she was, Mon Mothma. Though he didn't have that name yet. He had leader, intelligent, measured, genuinely believes what she's fighting for, politically sophisticated in ways that suggested both strength and limitation. She spoke at length, with Melshi translating into simplified gestures that Chirrut then relayed through their established vocabulary. A chain of communication so elaborate, it should have lost everything in translation. But somehow, through Chirrut's remarkable sensitivity to meaning beneath language, retained its essential shape. What she was offering: resources, information. The Alliance's considerable intelligence network turned toward the question of what Jin-Woo was and where he came from. Potentially a path home, if such a thing existed, because the Alliance had contacts in every corner of the galaxy, including corners where unusual dimensional phenomena had been recorded. What she was asking in return: the obvious thing. A being that could neutralize 40 soldiers without casualties, move through sensor grids, teleport through shadows, and produce an energy signature that sent Imperial systems into confusion was, from a purely strategic perspective, an extraordinary asset. She wasn't crude about it. She framed it as mutual benefit, as shared interest in opposing a regime that harmed everyone it touched. She was not wrong that the Empire caused harm. He had seen enough of Jedha to understand that with complete clarity. But Sung Jin-Woo had not become the Shadow Monarch by making decisions reactively. He sat in that holographic chamber and thought about what being an Alliance asset actually meant, the commitments it implied, the operations it would involve, the degree to which his path home would become contingent on his usefulness to someone else's war. He thought about the fact that he had been in this galaxy for less than a day, and already 2 significant factions had attempted to recruit him, which suggested that the pace of entanglement would only accelerate. He thought about what he actually needed: information about dimensional phenomena, scientific expertise, time to research without constant interruption from soldiers trying to contain him. He gestured to Chirrut, who leaned in. Jin-Woo composed his response carefully in their gestural language, making sure each element was clear before moving to the next. I am not a soldier for your war. I don't know your causes or your history well enough to fight for them. What I need is information and time. If you can provide those things without requiring me to become your weapon, I will consider cooperation. If cooperation means I become a piece in your strategy that you move when useful, the answer is no. Chirrut conveyed this to Melshi. Melshi conveyed it to Mon Mothma. There was a pause in the holographic chamber, the pause of a skilled politician recalibrating. She responded. Melshi translated. Chirrut gestured. She says that the Alliance does not own its allies. She says she understands the distinction between cooperation and conscription. She says she has one piece of information to offer as a gesture of good faith, freely, with no condition attached. Jin-Woo waited. The Empire is building something. Something that makes that mechanical moon above Jedha look like the beginning of a sentence. She doesn't know what it is, but she knows who does. And that person, Galen Erso, is being held against his will to build it, and he has been trying to get a message out for years. She believes that what the Empire is building may be relevant to dimensional instabilities that have been recorded in 3 separate star systems over the past 8 months. Phenomena that have no conventional explanation. Jin-Woo went still. Dimensional instabilities. 3 star systems, 8 months. He didn't know enough about this galaxy's physics to be certain, but he knew what had opened the rift that brought him here. And then he knew that sovereign-level energy at the scale of what he'd been generating didn't dissipate. It propagated. If his transit had caused ripples, he looked at Chirrut, made a new gesture, one he hadn't needed before. "I need to find this man immediately." Chirrut smiled, the smile of someone who had correctly anticipated where the conversation was going. He gestured back. "She thought you might say that." What neither Jin-Woo nor Mon Mothma knew in that moment of cautious alignment was that the conversation had been partially intercepted. Not the content, the Alliance's encryption was genuinely sophisticated, but the fact of it. An Imperial Signals Intelligence unit had flagged an unusual comm pattern from the way station's direction, cross-referenced it with Jedha's incident reports, and added it to the file that was currently sitting on a desk on Coruscant in front of a man who collected dangerous things the way other people collected debts. Grand Moff Tarkin read the file slowly, in the way he read everything, completely, without rushing, extracting every useful implication before moving to the next line. When he finished, he set it down and looked out the window of his office at the endless city planet spread below him, lit from horizon to horizon in the perpetual amber glow of a civilization that had decided the most efficient form of government was absolute control. Then, he picked up his comm. "The Emperor's advisors mentioned a peculiarity from Jedha," he said when the line connected. "I'd like to discuss resource allocation, specifically." He glanced at the file. "I'd like to discuss what happens when you send stormtroopers to manage a problem, and the problem simply doesn't register that stormtroopers are relevant." On the other end of the comm, Director Krennic made a sound that suggested he was already exhausted by this conversation, and it hadn't properly started yet. Tarkin smiled thinly. "I thought you'd feel that way. Here's what we're going to do." Galen Erso was a man who had learned to live inside guilt the way other men lived inside houses, moving through its rooms daily, knowing every corner, having long since stopped being surprised by its dimensions. He worked on the weapon because the alternative was the deaths of people he loved, and he sabotaged it because the alternative was the deaths of everyone else. And he carried both of those truths simultaneously with the specific exhaustion of someone balancing 2 weights that together exceeded what any one person should bear. He was brilliant, precise, and completely alone in the way that people are alone when surrounded by enemies who believe they are colleagues. He was in the middle of a 17-hour calculation cycle in his private research quarters on the Imperial facility on Iadu when the power went out. Not a fluctuation. Not a brownout. Everything, lights, terminals, door mechanisms, the atmospheric processors that kept the facility's internal climate habitable against Iadu's permanent storm system. Everything simply stopped, cleanly and simultaneously, as though someone had reached into the facility's power infrastructure and removed it the way you'd remove a battery. The emergency lighting came on 6 seconds later, dim red strips along the floor that cast everything in the color of old blood. Galen sat in the sudden dark and listened. The facility had 400 personnel. He heard none of them. Jin-Woo had found the facility through the shadows before the uncertain Mercy completed its approach vector. Iadu was a planet of permanent storm, thick cloud cover that turned the sky into a textured gray ceiling. A rain that fell not in drops, but in dense shifting curtains, lightning that moved through the clouds in constant horizontal chains. It was, from a shadow perspective, extraordinary. Every surface of the planet was saturated with deep, complex darkness. Layered shadows from cloud cover above and rock formations below. Shadow pockets in every crevice of the mountainous terrain that Jin-Woo could read and move through, with the precision of a man walking a familiar street. He had shadow exchanged to the facility's exterior, assessed it in under a minute. Power grid running along exterior conduits, guard rotations in predictable patterns, 4 entry points with varying security levels, and inside, amid 400 Imperial life signatures, one that was different, not in any mystical sense, or in the sense that one person in the facility was awake at this hour, doing something technically complex in a private space, which in an Imperial installation meant either someone very important or someone doing something they weren't supposed to, and those categories frequently overlapped. He had disabled the power grid not for drama, but for efficiency. Unconscious guards couldn't call for backup. Dark hallways were his hallways. He found Galen Erso's quarters in 40 seconds. The scientist looked up from his chair as the door opened. Not the sliding mechanism the door was supposed to use, but pulled open manually by someone who had found the emergency release in the dark and used it with the confidence of someone who read infrastructure quickly. In the red emergency lighting, the figure in the doorway was extraordinary. Black armor that seemed to absorb even the dim light, shadow moving around the shoulders in slow, deliberate patterns, eyes carrying a faint luminescence that had no power source Galen could identify. Galen Erso was a man who had spent years surrounded by things designed to intimidate him. He looked at Jin-Woo and felt, inexplicably, not fear, but the specific alertness of a scientist encountering a phenomenon outside his current model. "You're not Imperial," he said. Jin-Woo looked at him, said something in a language Galen didn't recognize. Then, with evident frustration at the persistent language problem, held up a hand, palm out, non-threatening, and made a gesture that was universal enough. "I'm not here to hurt you." Galen stood slowly. He had approximately 30 seconds before the emergency protocols routed power restoration through the backup grid, at which point this facility would go from dark and confused to dark and actively dangerous. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, and he had been thinking about escape for years. He looked at this impossible armored figure in his doorway and made a decision with the swiftness that comes from having already done all the preparatory thinking. He picked up a data drive from under his desk, a specific data drive he had prepared and hidden there 18 months ago, and held it up, then pointed at the door, then at himself. "Take me with you." Jin-Woo looked at the data drive, looked at the man, looked at the facility around them where power restoration was already humming in the walls, and then he stepped aside from the door and gestured. "Move quickly." They were gone before the backup grid completed its cycle. 3 shadow transits. Galen's first experience of the technique produced a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a suppressed shout. The specific vocalization of a physicist experiencing something that violated his professional understanding of how space worked. Deposited them in the uncertain Mercy's cargo hold with 20 seconds to spare before the facility's alarms began their cascade. Chirrut was already gesturing before Jin-Woo had fully materialized. "Baze says there are 2 Imperial shuttles changing vector toward us." Jin-Woo held up a hand. "Give me a moment." He reached through the shadows, stretching his perception out through Eadu's storm-soaked darkness, through the cloud layers, and into the upper atmosphere where the 2 Imperial shuttles were banking toward the freighter's position. Each shuttle carried a pilot, a co-pilot, and 8 soldiers. 20 people. He reached further. Eadu's orbital space held 3 star destroyers maintaining the system blockade, and on the lead destroyer, He felt what he had felt on Jeddah. That particular awareness of something powerful tracking him through means he didn't use himself, Vader again, or someone else of comparable significance. He made a decision. The shadows that pooled in the corners of both Imperial shuttle cockpits rose simultaneously. Two precise, targeted applications of shadow saturation, remote and surgical. The Shadow Monarch's authority extending across 50 kilometers of storm-lashed atmosphere with the same ease it would have across 50 meters. The shuttle's pilots went under. The shuttles continued on their last heading for approximately 4 seconds and then began slow, uncontrolled drifts that would deposit them, eventually, on Eadu's surface at velocities that would damage nothing worse than the shuttle's landing struts. Jin-Woo released the shadows and turned to find Galen Erso staring at him. The scientist had a look on his face that Jin-Woo recognized. He had seen it on researchers in his own world who had encountered gate phenomena beyond their existing frameworks. Not fear, hunger. The specific intellectual hunger of a brilliant mind encountering something that rewrote parameters. Galen held up the data drive again and said something. Then, visibly remembering the language barrier, switched to a different approach. He went to the cargo hold's small terminal, pulled up a visual display, and began drawing. Diagrams, energy diagrams, wave patterns, the visual language of physics that transcended spoken vocabulary. He was showing Jin-Woo the dimensional instabilities. 3 star systems, as Mon Mothma had said. But Galen's data was more specific. The instabilities weren't random. They were residual patterns, energy echoes, and the waveform he was drawing, the signature that the instabilities shared, was something he had been trying to reverse engineer for 8 months because the Empire had ordered him to, believing it was a new weapon or power source. He pointed to the waveform. Then he pointed at Jin-Woo. Then he drew an arrow between them. Jin-Woo looked at the waveform for a long time. He didn't have instruments or data to confirm it, but the shape of it, the underlying pattern, it was his. And the dimensional transit that had brought him here had left marks on this galaxy's space-time the way a ship leaves a wake. And those marks were what the Empire had been investigating. The Empire knew something had come through. They just didn't know what. Until Jeddah. Galen was drawing again, rapidly, with the urgent efficiency of someone who had been waiting to tell this to someone for a very long time. He drew the weapon. Not in detail, the data drive had the details, but in concept. A planet killer. A machine that focused energy so precisely it could destabilize a planetary body from distance. And the energy source it used, Kyber crystals, refined and concentrated at scales that conventional physics suggested should be impossible. He stopped drawing and looked at Jin-Woo directly, and made a gesture even without knowing their vocabulary. Both hands outward, encompassing, the universal gesture for, "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Jin-Woo looked at the diagrams, at the waveform that was his transit signature, at the planet killer schematics, at the data drive in Galen's hand. He understood. The Empire wasn't just building a weapon. They were building something that operated at energy scales that approached the level of his own transit event. And if they fired that weapon, if they destabilized a planetary body using concentrated Kyber energy at those scales, the waveform interaction with his residual transit signature could do something none of them wanted. It could open more rifts, unpredictable ones, galaxy-wide. Or it could close the one he needed to get home. And he sat down on a cargo crate and was very still for a moment, not paralyzed, but thinking with the focused intensity that had carried him through every S-rank gate he'd ever entered. Galen Erso watched him with the patience of a man who understood that some calculations took time. Chirrut appeared at the hold entrance and made a gesture. "We are clear of Iadu. Where do we go?" Jin-Woo looked at Galen. Galen looked back with an expression that said, "I go where you go. I have nowhere else." Jin-Woo looked at the data drive, at the diagrams, at the waveform that was his own echo. He stood and made the gesture that had become their shorthand for destinations requiring significant preparation. "We need somewhere safe to think." Baze's voice came from the cockpit, conveyed back by Chirrut. "He says there is no safe anywhere in this galaxy." Jin-Woo almost smiled. "Then find me the least dangerous option." Above them, on the lead Star Destroyer over Iadu, an Inquisitor named the Third Sister stood at the viewport watching two shuttles drift into the planet's atmosphere on dead power and felt the gap in the Force accelerate away into hyperspace. She had a secondary directive from Vader, issued before his return to Coruscant following the Jedha incident. She opened her comm. "The asset has acquired the scientist," she said. "It moves with purpose now. It knows something." A pause. "Recommendation: stop treating this as a containment problem. It cannot be contained." Another pause. "Recommendation: stop treating it as a recruitment problem. It will not be recruited." Her voice carried the specific flat certainty of someone who had assessed the situation without ego or wishful thinking. "My recommendation is that we tell the Emperor exactly what we have found and let him decide what a thing like this actually is." On Coruscant, the Emperor was already deciding. He had been deciding since Vader's first report. He had been deciding with the slow, architecturally precise patience of someone who had spent decades building structures of power so complex that most people couldn't even perceive them, let alone navigate them. He sat in his office above the world and felt the gap in the Force moving through hyperspace, and thought about what it meant that darkness had a sovereign it had not elected and had not corrupted and did not control. He thought about what that sovereign might become if properly directed. He thought about what it would mean to his own position if that sovereign was not directed at all. He reached for his comm with one ancient hand. "Prepare my personal shuttle," he said, "and tell the Inquisitorius, all of them, that I will be leading this operation personally." The planet Ord Mantell had a reputation in certain circles as a place where inconvenient things went to become someone else's problem. Its cities were a geological sediment of jurisdictions. Imperial law on top, local authority beneath that, criminal syndicate infrastructure below that, and at the very bottom, older arrangements that predated all of them and intended to outlast all of them too. It was the kind of place where a battered freighter could land at a secondary port without triggering automatic flags, where a man who had just been extracted from an Imperial research facility could sit in a back room and not immediately become a headline, and where the food, while not good, was reliably available at any hour. Galen Erso ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been living on Imperial ration schedules and intended to make up for lost nutritional autonomy. Jin-Woo didn't eat. He hadn't needed to since becoming the Shadow Monarch, sustaining himself on shadow energy in ways that would have alarmed anyone who thought about it too carefully, and instead sat across the table and watched Galen work through the data drive's contents on a portable terminal, cross-referencing with the diagrams he'd drawn on the uncertain Mercy and adding new notations with the rapid precision of a man for whom thinking and writing were the same continuous motion. Chirrut sat nearby in meditation, which he did periodically throughout the day, and which produced in his immediate vicinity a quality of stillness that Jin-Woo found interesting. A small radius of particular calm in the Force's fabric, like a smooth stone in moving water. Baze was at the room's single window, watching the street below with the professional patience of a man who had decided that the correct response to an unprecedented situation was to cover the fundamentals. The language problem was evolving, not solved. Nothing about their situation permitted the luxury of a solution, but evolving. Galen was a linguist in the functional sense that all excellent scientists were linguists. He understood that communication systems had underlying structures, and underlying structures could be mapped. Over the past several hours of hyperspace transit and planetfall, he had been building a bridging vocabulary with Jin-Woo. Not full language, but a working pigeon of gesture, diagram, and the handful of sounds that both of them had established carried consistent meaning. It was crude. It was, for the purposes of sharing technical information about dimensional physics, sufficient. What Galen had found in his own data, the data he'd been hiding from the Empire for 8 months, was more specific than he'd conveyed in the cargo hold. He spread it now across the terminal in organized sections and walked Jin-Woo through it with the methodical patience of a brilliant teacher who had spent years explaining complex things to people whose understanding he needed. The dimensional instabilities had a point of origin, not a precise point. The instrumentation wasn't fine enough for that. But a region, a volume of space approximately 2 light-years across in the outer rim, far from any inhabited system, where the fabric of space-time had been stressed by something enormous passing through it. The stress had propagated outward as ripples, and those ripples were the instabilities that had been registering on sensors across 3 star systems for 8 months. Jin-Woo looked at the origin point on the star map and felt the specific sensation of a hypothesis aligning with evidence. That was where his transit had occurred. That was the wound in reality that had swallowed him. And it was, according to Galen's data, still open, not wide, not actively transiting anything, but present. A scar that hadn't fully closed. A door left ajar. Galen pointed to the scar, then to the Death Star schematics on the drive, then ran a simulation, crude, built from the data he'd been quietly accumulating while pretending to optimize targeting systems. That showed what happened to the scar when the Death Star fired at full power within range of it. 2 outcomes, depending on variables. Either the scar collapsed permanently, sealed by the energy interaction, or it expanded catastrophically. Not just opening, but rupturing, destabilizing a volume of space-time large enough to affect multiple star systems simultaneously. Jin-Woo looked at the simulation for a long time, then looked at Galen and made the gesture for, which outcome is more likely? Galen made the gesture he had developed for unknown, hands turning outward, the physics-honest admission of uncertainty, then held up 2 fingers and indicated one was slightly more probable than the other, the catastrophic rupture. Marginally, Jin-Woo sat back and thought about the geometry of his situation. The scar was his way home, the only way home he'd found evidence of in this galaxy. The Empire was building something that could destroy it permanently or turn it into a catastrophe. The Alliance wanted to destroy the Death Star, which would solve the Imperial problem but potentially destabilize the scar through the energy release of the station's destruction, depending on proximity and timing. Every path forward had consequences that intersected with every other path forward. He had operated in dungeons where the exit was also the trap. He knew how to think through layered outcomes. But those dungeons hadn't had 400 million people on nearby planets as collateral considerations. He was still thinking when the door opened. Melshi had followed them to Ord Mantell, which wasn't surprising. Intelligence operatives followed things. It was professionally definitional. He arrived with 2 Alliance soldiers and the expression of a man who was delivering a message he hadn't written and wasn't certain he agreed with. Mon Mothma's message, relayed through Melshi's careful phrasing, had 3 components. First, They knew about Galen. They had known Galen was on Eadu and had been planning an extraction. Jin-Woo had moved faster than their timeline, which was both impressive and inconvenient for certain operational plans. Second, the data drive Galen carried was critical to the Alliance's most important current operation, and they needed access to it. Third, and here, Melshi's careful phrasing became most careful. The Emperor had left Coruscant personally, with the full Inquisitorius, moving toward the Outer Rim on a trajectory that intersected with Galen's last known position, and by extension, their current one. Jin-Woo processed this. The Emperor, the ultimate authority of the force that controlled this galaxy, was moving personally, not sending agents, not dispatching Vader, coming himself. He filed that under significant, then filed it further under. This individual believes their personal power is relevant to this situation. He looked at Melshi and made the gesture that Chirrut translated smoothly. How long before they arrive? Melshi's response, 36 hours, estimated. The Emperor's shuttle was fast, but not instantaneous, and the Imperial signals intelligence that had triangulated their position had taken time to process. 36 hours. Jin-Woo stood and began making decisions. What followed was 18 hours of the most concentrated preparation Sung Jin-Woo had engaged in since the final battle on Earth. He used the time the way he used all time, completely, without waste, with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that preparation was the difference between winning and surviving. Galen worked with Melshi on the data drive, not handing it over, but providing the specific technical information the Alliance needed while retaining the deeper schematics that related to the dimensional scar. Jin-Woo sat with them for portions of this, not understanding the spoken exchange, but reading Galen's body language with the precision of someone who had spent years reading people in high-stakes environments, ensuring that nothing was given away that Galen hadn't consciously decided to give. Honor Chirrut spent the hours in a different kind of preparation. He sat with Jin-Woo and they talked, in their gestural language, supplemented now by Galen's pidgin additions, about the Force. Not tactically, philosophically. Chirrut had questions that he had been composing since Jeddah, and Jin-Woo had been curious about the Force since he'd felt his shadows shift near the Kyber Shrine. And the conversation that resulted was, improbably, the most interesting exchange either of them had in years. Chirrut conveyed, "The Force connects all living things. It flows through everything. You are a living thing, and yet it flows around you rather than through you." Why? Jin-Woo thought about this, then conveyed, "I already have something that connects me to everything. The shadows are in everything dark. All darkness is mine. Perhaps the Force and the shadows do not combine because they are the same category of thing, not enemies, but parallel systems. Two rivers from different mountains." Chirrut was very still for a long moment after receiving this. Then, "I have been listening to the Force my entire life. I have never heard it describe itself that way, but I think you might be right." Jin-Woo, "Does that concern you?" Chirrut, "No. It makes the universe larger. I prefer a larger universe." Base, overhearing this exchange in its gestural form, made a sound that in any language meant, "Only you two would find this calming." The Inquisitors arrived in 29 hours, 7 hours ahead of schedule because the Emperor did not move on schedules that his enemies had calculated. He moved on schedules that made his enemies' calculations obsolete. Jin-Woo felt them enter the system before any sensor on Ord Mantell registered their arrival. Felt them through the darkness of space itself. The shadow energy that permeated the void between stars, carrying the impression of multiple powerful presences moving with coordinated purpose. Not the specific gap in the Force quality of the Emperor, whom he still hadn't directly perceived, but something adjacent. Force users of significant power, moving in a formation that suggested practiced group tactics. He counted 7 distinct signatures. Then, behind them, something else. Something vast and still and very, very old. He stood from the table where he'd been reviewing Galen's star maps and said in Korean, calmly, "They're here." Chirrut looked up immediately. Baze had his cannon in his hands before the sentence finished. On Melshi's hand went to his comm. Jin-Woo held up a hand, the gesture for, "Wait, everyone wait." He closed his eyes. The Shadow Monarch reached into the darkness of Ord Mantell, into the city's shadows, the building's shadows, the shadows in every alley and basement and unlit corner of the settlement around them. And through those shadows, he perceived the Inquisitors landing, their dispersal into the city in a search pattern, and the shuttle that landed separately, with more ceremony, further from the city center. From that shuttle, one figure emerged and moved toward the city with the particular quality of presence that Jin-Woo had felt from Vader, multiplied by something he didn't have a number for yet. He opened his eyes, looked at Chirrut, made a new gesture. Both hands pressed together, then slowly moved apart, indicating separation, then pointed at Galen, then at Melshi, then at the door. "Get him out. Get him away from here. This is about to become something that Galen cannot be present for." Chirrut understood immediately. Conveyed to Baze. Baze looked at Jin-Woo with an expression that asked, very directly, "And you?" Jin-Woo looked at the ceiling, through the floors above it, and the sky above that, toward the vast old presence moving through Ord Mantell's streets toward them. He thought about 7 Inquisitors. He thought about the scar in space that was his way home. He thought about the Death Star and dimensional ruptures and 36 hours of careful preparation. He reached into the shadows and felt his army. 10,000 extracted shadows standing in perfect silence in the darkness between dimensions. Waiting. Soldiers, monsters, S-rank hunters, dungeon bosses, ancient creatures from gates that had tested him to his absolute limit. All of them, all waiting. He looked at Baze. Then he made a gesture he hadn't needed before. New, precise, and completely unambiguous. "I'll be fine. Go." Baze held his gaze for 2 seconds, then nodded, the same nod as before, binding and honest, and moved, ushering Galen toward the building's back exit with Melshi and his soldiers. Chirrut paused at the door, turned back. In their gestural language, quietly, "The Force does not know what you are, but I do." Jin-Woo looked at him, waited. "You are someone who protects things. That is enough." Then Chirrut was gone, his staff tapping a rapid rhythm down the back corridor. And Jin-Woo was alone in the room with the star maps and the diagrams, and the shadow of an old man's footsteps still warm on the Force's fabric. He turned toward the front of the building. He let the Dragon Emperor armor settle around him fully, not the restrained configuration he'd been maintaining, but the complete expression of it. Shadow rising from his shoulders like dark wings, the purple luminescence of his eyes brightening to something that was almost a light source in itself. Outside, on Ord Mantell's dusty streets, Darth Sidious walked through a parting crowd with his hood drawn and his ancient hands folded and his yellow eyes already searching, already finding, already calculating, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment since Vader's first report. The Shadow Monarch was waiting for him. For the first time in a very long time, the Emperor walked towards something he had not already defeated in his mind. The street outside was empty by the time Jin-Woo stepped through the front door. Ord Mantell's residents had the survival instinct common to people who lived in layered jurisdictions. They recognized the specific quality of quiet that preceded violence and responded to it by being somewhere else with impressive speed. Shop fronts had shuttered. The ambient noise of the settlement had dropped to wind and distant machinery. Even the criminal elements that normally populated this district's corners had found pressing business in other districts. 7 inquisitors stood in a loose formation across the street. Jin-Woo assessed them in the time it took to step off the building's threshold. Red-bladed lightsabers either drawn or ready. Boss combat stances varied enough to suggest different training philosophies unified by a single organizational purpose. Force presences that registered to his shadow perception as 7 points of significant energy burning with the specific quality he'd come to associate with the Force's darker applications. Powerful, coordinated, completely focused on him. Behind them, 40 meters back, Darth Sidious stood alone in the street. He had lowered his hood. Jin-Woo looked at him and performed the same assessment he performed on everything. Threat level, capability indicators, intent, and found, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, that the assessment took longer than usual. Not because the Emperor was physically impressive. He was not. An ancient, ruined body wrapped in black robes, moving with the slow deliberateness of someone for whom physical speed was no longer the point. But the presence around him was extraordinary. A density of dark side power that compressed the air in its vicinity, that made the force in the surrounding area behave differently the way gravity makes light behave differently near massive objects. The 7 inquisitors were burning points of energy. Sidious was a collapsed star. He looked at Jin-Woo with yellow eyes that carried no surprise, no fear, and no uncertainty whatsoever. "Remarkable," he said, in galactic basic that Jin-Woo still couldn't translate. His tone was the tone of a collector examining an acquisition. "You are precisely as described, and yet the description was entirely inadequate." Jin-Woo didn't respond. He was watching the shadows. The Sidious had not come to Ord Mantell to fight. He had come to evaluate, which was a different enterprise entirely, and one he was considerably better at. He had spent 60 years evaluating beings, situations, and power structures, and the evaluation always preceded everything else. The manipulation, the corruption, the patient architectural work of making the universe into the shape he wanted it. You could not shape what you had not first understood. What he understood about the being across the street in the span of 30 seconds of observation. It was not force sensitive. It was not connected to the dark side in any conventional sense. And yet the darkness around it was the most complete darkness he had encountered in 6 decades of Sith practice. Not the passionate, consuming darkness of the Sith tradition, not the grasping, hungry darkness that he himself embodied, but something older and more absolute. A darkness that didn't want, a darkness that simply was. He found this genuinely interesting. He found it simultaneously, completely unacceptable. There could not be a sovereign of darkness that he did not control. It violated the fundamental premise of his entire project. He spoke again, calmly, conversationally, the voice of a man who had decided that the correct opening was explanation. "You don't understand what I'm saying. That's a temporary problem. Let me demonstrate something more universal." He raised one hand. The force lightning that left his fingers was not a combat technique in that moment. It was a demonstration. Controlled, precise, a column of crackling blue-white energy directed not at Jin-Woo, but at the building to his left, which it struck and partially collapsed with the casual authority of someone making a point about capability. In the force, it registered as an extraordinary concentration of dark side energy, focused and released with a precision that spoke of decades of refinement. Jin-Woo watched the building collapse, looked back at Sidious. His expression didn't change. He raised his own hand. The ruler's authority extended across the street, not at Sidious, not at the Inquisitors, but at the collapsed building, reversing the collapse, lifting the rubble with the telekinetic precision of the Shadow Monarch's authority, and reassembling it. Not perfectly. The mortar was broken, the structure would need real repair. But the gesture was clear. A demonstration returned for a demonstration. I saw what you did. I can do something comparable. Now we both know. What do you actually want? Sidious looked at the reassembled building for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. The Inquisitors moved without verbal command, a force-communicated signal that Jin-Woo perceived as 7 simultaneous shifts in intent. And they were fast. Genuinely fast, with the force-enhanced speed that made them capable of engaging opponents far beyond normal human parameters. Red lightsabers ignited across the formation, and they came from multiple vectors simultaneously. The tactical coordination of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of engagement against powerful singular targets. The first one reached him in 0.3 seconds. Jin-Woo sidestepped without using the ruler's authority or shadow exchange. Purely physical. The movement of a body whose stats had long since exceeded what any world's strongest beings could match. The Inquisitor's blade passed through the space where his torso had been and found nothing. And Jin-Woo's hand closed on the Inquisitor's extended wrist with the precise force of someone who had calculated exactly how much pressure was required to end a threat without ending the person. The specific restraint of a man who had promised himself something on Jeddah and intended to keep it. The Inquisitor went down. 1. The second and third came from his flanks simultaneously. Jin-Woo's shadow exchanged. The transit so brief it barely registered as movement, simply a flicker of absence and return, and emerged behind both of them on 2 simultaneous pressure applications to nerve clusters that required knowing exactly where those clusters were and exactly how hard to compress them. Knowledge that came from fighting things with physiologies far more exotic than humanoid. 2 and 3. The 4th, 5th, and 6th came as a coordinated group, which was intelligent. Singular responses to singular attackers created predictable patterns. Jin-Woo didn't respond singularly. He expanded the shadow field, filling the immediate area with controlled darkness that didn't obscure his own perception, but interfered with force-enhanced sight in the specific way that sovereign-level shadow energy interfered with light-based senses. In the sudden local dark, 3 Inquisitors swinging at where he had been found each other's positions instead, on requiring split-second redirection that broke their coordinated timing. Jin-Woo moved through the darkness with complete comfort because the darkness was his, and took each of them down in the 3 seconds the timing break created. 4, 5, 6. Non-lethal. All of them breathing. The 7th didn't charge. The 7th Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor, whom Jin-Woo hadn't seen until now because he'd been positioned on a rooftop with a sight line across the entire engagement, landed in the street between Jin-Woo and Sidious and held his double-bladed lightsaber in a guard position. He was the best of the 7 by a considerable margin. Jin-Woo could read that from his stillness, the quality of someone who fought thoughtfully rather than reactively, who had watched the entire engagement and was now deploying conclusions rather than instinct. Impressive, the Grand Inquisitor said, with the specific controlled tone of someone who had expected this result and planned accordingly. He wasn't the last line of defense. He was a delay. Jin-Woo understood this immediately. He looked past the Grand Inquisitor at Sidious and made a gesture that needed no translation. Tell him to move. Sidious said something. The Grand Inquisitor stepped aside. Jin-Woo walked forward. They faced each other in the empty street with 20 meters between them and the sounds of 6 unconscious Inquisitors behind Jin-Woo and the distant growing noise of Imperial troop transports entering the settlement's perimeter ahead. Sidious looked at Jin-Woo with those yellow eyes and dropped entirely at the performance of the benign old man. What remained was the thing underneath, the Sith Lord who had dismantled a republic, corrupted a chosen one, and bent a galaxy to his singular will across the span of decades. In the Force, he was a collapsing star, dark, vast, consuming. Jin-Woo looked at him and reached inward. The army came. Not all of them. He exercised the same judgment he had exercised all day, the judgment that separated power from destruction. But enough. Shadows poured from every dark surface in the settlement simultaneously, coalescing into forms that stepped into the physical world with the perfect silent discipline of soldiers who had long ago passed beyond the need for fear or hesitation. Igris, his most trusted knight, materialized at his right side. The Shadow soldiers filled the street in a formation that placed Sidious and whatever Imperial forces were arriving on the other side of a wall of extracted darkness that stretched the full width of the settlement's main thoroughfare. Sidious looked at the army, looked at Igris, looked at the scale of what had just been summoned and was, for the first time in the encounter, genuinely recalculating. Then he raised both hands and unleashed the Force lightning at full power. Not a demonstration, not a controlled expression, but the complete and unrestrained output of a Sith Lord at the apex of his dark side ability. The kind of power that had incapacitated Luke Skywalker in moments, that had killed Mace Windu in seconds, that Vader himself had been unable to withstand. It struck Jin-Woo directly. Jin-Woo stood in it. The shadow energy around him moved. Not absorbing the lightning exactly, not deflecting it, but existing simultaneously with it in the specific way that sovereign-level darkness coexisted with other forms of dark power, neither consuming nor consumed. The lightning was real and it was painful. He felt it, registered it, cataloged it as significant. But pain was something Sung Jin-Woo had a different relationship with than most beings. He had died once, in a dungeon that the world had called impossible, and had been rebuilt into something stronger. Pain was information. It wasn't a limit. He walked through the lightning. 3 steps, 5, each one forward. The shadow energy rising around him as he moved. The Dragon Emperor armor absorbing and redistributing the electrical energy through the shadow field. The purple luminescence of his eyes brightening through blue-white lightning until the 2 light sources blurred together into something that had no clean category. Sidious's expression changed for the first time. Not fear. He was too old and too deeply committed to his philosophy for simple fear, but something adjacent to it. The recalculation of a man who had just discovered that his most definitive weapon was not, in this case, definitive. Jin-Woo stopped 2 meters away, extended his hand. The ruler's authority closed around Sidious, not crushing, not violent, simply present, the way a wall is present, the way gravity is present, and held him completely still with the absolute authority of something that had decided this conversation was concluded. In the Force, the dark side raged against the containment, and Sidious pushed with everything he had, the full weight of his dark side mastery, the accumulated power of 60 years of Sith practice, and the ruler's authority held. Not easily. Jin-Woo felt the resistance as genuine pressure, felt the Force as a real force pushing back against his authority, the collision of 2 sovereign-level systems operating simultaneously in the same physical space. But the Shadow Monarch had not become the Shadow Monarch by losing contests of will. He looked at Sidious in the containment and said something in Korean. Calm, even. The tone he used when a dungeon boss had finally understood the nature of its situation. Sidious couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Every living thing understood that tone. Jin-Woo reached into the held Emperor with a shadow extraction. Not to kill, not to add him to the army, but to read him the way he read every significant enemy, extracting the impression of capability and intent and the specific texture of what this being was. What he found was vast and dark and genuinely extraordinary. A mind of terrifying sophistication, a will of absolute iron, a relationship with power so long and so total that the power and the person had become nearly indistinguishable. He also found, in the deepest layer of what Sidious was, the one thing that Sith philosophy had always generated and always tried to pretend it hadn't: fear. Ancient, structural, foundational fear. The fear that had started everything. The fear of insignificance, of mortality, of a universe that didn't care about Sheev Palpatine specifically. Everything the Emperor had built was architecture around that fear. Walls to keep it out, weapons to destroy what threatened to remind him of it. Jin-Woo had seen that fear before. In dungeons, in men who became monsters because they couldn't survive being ordinary. He released the ruler's authority. Sidious stumbled, one step, quickly corrected. The dignity of a man who would not allow himself to be seen recovering. He looked at Jin-Woo with those yellow eyes, and the expression was different now. Not the collector's evaluation, not the combatant's calculation. Something rawer and much older. Jin-Woo turned his back on the Emperor and looked at his army. Then, with the precise authority of the Shadow Monarch, he began giving orders. The orders Jin-Woo gave his army were not the orders Darth Sidious expected. He had anticipated an assault, the logical continuation of a confrontation in which one party had just demonstrated complete physical superiority over the other. An army of shadows, given commands by their sovereign, should, by every tactical logic Sidious had ever studied, have moved to press that advantage. Instead, they moved outward through Ord Mantell's streets in every direction simultaneously, not attacking but positioning, filling the settlement's thoroughfares and rooftops and alleyways with silent shadow soldiers who stood at perfect attention and did nothing except exist, present and absolute. A cordon that the Imperial troop transports entering the settlement's perimeter encountered and then stopped at. Here their commanders making the rapid calculation that moving forward required engaging something their training had not covered. Jin-Woo turned back to Sidious, made a gesture that Sidious couldn't read through their language barrier, but whose meaning was legible through pure context. This is what restrained looks like. Consider what unrestrained would be. Then he looked upward. Above Ord Mantell, 3 Star Destroyers held orbital position, the fleet element that had accompanied the Emperor's personal shuttle. A display of force that would have been definitive in any conventional confrontation. Jin-Woo reached through the shadows, up through the atmosphere, through the exosphere, into the darkness of orbital space where his shadow energy moved with the same ease it moved through Ord Mantell's streets, and felt the 3 vessels, enormous. Each one crewed by thousands, each one carrying enough firepower to raise a city, each one from the Shadow Monarch's perspective. Simply a very large container full of shadows and the people those shadows belonged to. He reached into the lead destroyer's shadow network, the darkness in its corridors, its engine rooms, its command deck, and let his authority touch it, not to harm, to demonstrate. The lights on the destroyer's port side went dark in a pattern. 3 precise sections, controlled, deliberate, shadows pulled and held and then released. A message in the only language available across the void. I was there. I touched nothing. I chose to. On the command deck of the lead destroyer, officers stared at their panels and said nothing, because nothing in their training had given them vocabulary for this moment. Sidious watched Jin-Woo's face during all of this. watched the slight unfocusing of eyes that indicated perception operating somewhere other than the immediate visual field. Watched the absolute stillness of a being exerting authority across thousands of kilometers simultaneously, and performed the most important recalculation of his long political life. He spoke. Slowly, in the careful cadence of someone choosing every word with architectural precision, knowing the words wouldn't be understood, but that the manner of speaking them would carry information that transcended language. He was not offering alliance. He was not conceding defeat. He was doing something Darth Sidious had done perhaps 6 times in 6 decades of absolute authority. He was acknowledging a peer. Jin-Woo watched his face while he spoke and read the same things he always read. Intent beneath expression, truth beneath presentation. What Sidious was actually communicating, stripped of the words Jin-Woo couldn't parse. You are not what I thought you were. I have not decided what to do about that. Neither have you. We are both, in this moment, outside our established frameworks. Jin-Woo nodded once. Accurate. Then he reached into his armor and withdrew the data drive. Galen's data drive. The one with the Death Star schematics and the dimensional scar data and 8 months of hidden research compiled by the most gifted physicist in the Empire at enormous personal cost. He held it where Sidious could see it, and then, with the ruler's authority, he simply crushed it, not violently, not dramatically, but with the steady, precise pressure of someone closing a door. The drive compressed into itself and became a small, dense object that he let fall to the street between them. Sidious looked at the destroyed drive, then at Jin-Woo. The yellow eyes were unreadable in the way that only the most controlled minds were unreadable. Jin-Woo made a gesture, new, composed carefully, ensuring its meaning was clear. He pointed at the sky, at the orbital space where the Death Star was under construction, somewhere beyond visual range. Then he made the gesture Chirrut had taught him for the Force, a particular hand position that the blind guardian used when discussing the cosmic field. Then he made Galen's gesture for the dimensional scar. Then he connected all 3 with a sweeping motion that indicated consequence. Chain reaction, cascade. The linked nature of 3 separate things that Sidious needed to understand were not separate at all. Your weapon, the Force, my door home. They are connected. What you do to one affects the others. He didn't know if Sidious understood. He didn't know if the Emperor's intelligence network had already arrived at the same conclusion through different means. What he knew was that he had just communicated, without the data drive, without Galen, without any asset that could be extracted or captured or leveraged, communicated the essential fact that made the Death Star a problem for both of them. A weapon that could rupture space-time was a weapon that could rupture the Force. And the Force was the foundation of Darth Sidious's power. The Grand Inquisitor had recovered during all of this, and now stood 10 meters back with his lightsaber held loosely, not threatening. Watching the exchange between his Emperor and the Shadow Monarch, with the expression of a highly trained intelligence who had correctly assessed that participating would be counterproductive. He would report everything he had observed. He was already composing the report. What he observed next, he would spend considerable time trying to describe accurately. Sidious reached into his robes and withdrew a small device, a personal comm, the kind that operated on frequencies so encrypted that cracking them would take resources equivalent to a small fleet. He held it for a moment, looking at it, and then looked at Jin-Woo with an expression that was the closest thing to honest the Emperor had shown all day. He placed the comm on the street between them and stepped back. It was not a weapon. It was not a trap. It was, as best as Jin-Woo could assess through every analytical tool available to him, simply a means of communication. An offer extended not from power or manipulation, but from the specific pragmatism of a man who had just updated his model of the universe and needed a channel to the thing that had caused that update. Jin-Woo looked at the comm for a long moment. He thought about everything the Empire was and did. Jeddah, the occupation, the children against the tunnel walls, the systematic consumption of a galaxy by a man who had built his entire architecture of power around the fear of being ordinary. He thought about Galen Erso and 18 months of hidden sabotage. He thought about Mon Mothma's eyes and the weight behind them, while he did not pick up the comm. Instead, he looked at Sidious directly and made a gesture that was not in any vocabulary they had developed, raw, unambiguous, requiring no translation. I am not yours. I will never be yours. But I am also not your enemy, while you leave me alone to do what I came here to do. Then he turned and walked back through his army, which parted for him with the silent precision of 10,000 soldiers who had no agenda except their sovereign's direction. And he didn't look back at Sidious or the Grand Inquisitor or the frozen troop transports at the settlement's perimeter. He found Chirrut and Baze and Galen 3 kilometers north of the settlement, in a shallow canyon where the uncertain Mercy had landed on a dry riverbed with its engines already warm. Melshi was there with 2 Alliance soldiers, and they all looked at Jin-Woo with a specific collective expression of people who had heard distant sounds suggesting significant events, and were now performing rapid assessments of whether those events had produced a good outcome or a complicated one. Chirrut read him first, as Chirrut always did. Not with eyes, but with everything else. The accumulated sensitivity of a lifetime of listening. He made a gesture. What happened? Jin-Woo was quiet for a moment, then gestured back with the specific understatement of a man who had learned that brevity was usually more accurate than elaboration. I had a conversation. Baze made the sound that meant, that is not a complete answer. Jin-Woo almost smiled. No, but it is the correct amount of answer. He looked at Galen. The scientist was watching him with those physics-hungry eyes, and the ones that processed experiences data, and Jin-Woo gestured, the drive. Galen understood, not that it was destroyed, not yet, but that the situation had changed. He held up a hand and produced, from inside his jacket, a second drive. Smaller, different. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had spent years working in an environment where redundancy was the difference between the mission surviving and the mission dying, and had planned accordingly. Jin-Woo looked at the second drive, then at Galen, then made a gesture that incorporated several of their established vocabulary elements into something new. Everything on that drive about the scar. Everything. Give it to me. Galen looked at the drive, then at Jin-Woo, then at Melshi, who was watching this exchange with the alert interest of an intelligence operative processing a variable he hadn't anticipated. Galen made the gesture for, and the weapon data. Jin-Woo pointed at Melshi. Galen nodded slowly. He connected the drive to the terminal Melshi's soldiers had set up on a portable field table, divided the data into 2 sections with the efficient precision of someone who had been compartmentalizing information for years, and handed the weapon schematic section to Melshi and a small extracted file to Jin-Woo. The file contained 3 things: the dimensional scar's precise coordinates, its current stability measurements, and Galen's calculations for the energy threshold that would either seal it or rupture it. Everything Jin-Woo needed to get home. Everything he needed to understand the geometry of his own situation in this galaxy. He held the file and felt, for the first time since the rift had swallowed him, that the weight of the problem had taken on the specific quality of a solvable problem rather than an impossible one. Different. Better. He spent the final hours before departure doing 3 things. He reinforced the scar's stability from a distance, reaching through space with the shadow energy, feeding sovereign-level darkness into the wounded fabric of space-time around the rift. Not opening it further, but shoring it, the way you shore a cracking wall. It took 4 hours and considerable concentration, and when he finished, the scar's stability measurements on Galen's instruments had improved by 37%. Enough to survive the Death Star's construction without rupturing if the weapon stayed away from that region of space. Enough to transit when he was ready. He said goodbye to Chirrut the way people say goodbye when they have developed genuine respect for each other across an almost complete absence of shared language. Through the gestural vocabulary they had built together, through the quality of attention they paid each other, through the specific honesty that comes from communication stripped of everything except meaning. Chirrut's final gesture. The Force still doesn't know what you are, but the Force is glad you were here. Jin-Woo's response. Tell the Force it has very good taste in worlds. Baze watched this and made the sound that in any language meant, I will never understand either of you, but I am glad you both exist. He said goodbye to Galen differently. No gestures, just a long look that communicated what their pigeon vocabulary couldn't fully carry. What you've done, what you're still doing, costs something real. I understand that cost. It's worth it. Galen looked back with the eyes of a man who needed that said, by someone who had no reason to say it except that it was true, and nodded once in the way that true things are nodded to. He did not say goodbye to Melshi, who was already transmitting the weapon schematics to Mon Mothma through an encrypted channel, and who was, Jin-Woo understood, exactly where he was supposed to be doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He stood at the uncertain Mercy's ramp and looked at the canyon walls and the gray sky above Ord Mantell, and thought about a galaxy he had been in for 4 days that had tried to contain him, recruit him, study him, and defeat him, and had managed none of these things, and had given him, in exchange for the failure, 2 people he would have been genuinely glad to know under any circumstances. A physicist who was the bravest person he'd met in either world, and a clear path home. He walked into the shadow beneath the ramp, and the Shadow Monarch was gone. Above the outer rim, in a region of space that no inhabited system was near enough to observe, the dimensional scar shimmered in the darkness between stars. A wound in space-time that had been slowly closing for 8 months and was now, after 4 hours of sovereign-level reinforcement, stable enough to survive the next several years of this galaxy's turbulent history. Stable enough, specifically, to survive the destruction of a space station by a single precise proton torpedo delivered through an exhaust port no larger than a womp rat. The explosion that would follow, and the ripple that explosion sent through the Force and through space-time simultaneously. The scar would outlast the Empire. Not by much, but enough. And through it, in the moment before it finally sealed, one shadow passed, moving with the unhurried certainty of something returning to its proper place, its proper darkness, its proper sovereignty. The stars of a different galaxy fell away behind it. The stars of home opened ahead. Sung Jin-Woo crossed back into his world, and the scar closed behind him like an eye. In the Force, across the galaxy he had left, something shifted. Subtle, structural, the kind of change that sensitive beings felt as a difference in atmosphere without being able to name its source. Chirrut felt it as a breath released. Darth Vader felt it as a silence where something had been. Darth Sidious felt it as the specific absence of a problem he had not solved and could not pursue, and would spend 3 private hours refusing to admit had unsettled him. And in a canyon on Ord Mantell, a blind guardian of the wills smiled at the sky and said nothing. Because some things the Force communicated didn't need to be translated. The galaxy continued its war. The scar continued its closing. And somewhere between dimensions, in the darkness that connected all dark things, and the Shadow Monarch's army stood at perfect attention and waited for the next gate to open, as they always had, as they always would. As if nothing had happened, as if everything had. In the end, Sung Jin-Woo left the Star Wars galaxy precisely as he had arrived. Without permission, without ceremony, and entirely on his own terms. He came as an accident and departed as a sovereign. And the distance between those two things was measured not in power, which he had carried with him always, but in understanding. He had walked through an empire and declined to conquer it. He had faced a Sith Lord and declined to destroy him. He had held a galaxy's most dangerous secret in his hands and chosen carefully what to do with it. These were not the choices of a weapon or an asset or an anomaly to be contained. They were the choices of a man who knew exactly what he was and had decided, in a foreign galaxy with no obligation to anyone in it, to be something more than merely the strongest thing in the room. Chirrut Imwe would speak of him once, years later, to a young man on a desert moon who needed to understand that the Force was larger than any single tradition, any single philosophy, any single definition of what power was supposed to look like. He would describe a darkness that was not the dark side, a sovereign that was not a Sith, a man who had walked through lightning and chosen restraint. The young man would ask what happened to him. Chirrut would smile. "He went home," he would say. "Some beings always find their way home."